The dualism that has characterized Western science since the 17th century, it's so deeply ingrained, I think many of us take it for granted, even if we don't believe in it. The Cartesian dualism that focuses especially scientific interest on objective phenomena in the physical world, and these are thought to have primary qualities independent of experience. The question is, when nobody's looking, what's really out there? All right. When we're looking with human eyeballs, I see your red shirt, but as any physicist or neuroscientist will tell you, there's not a molecule in your shirt as some objectively existing independent entity out there that is red, right? And so Descartes was aware of this. In the 17th century, we're getting all of these anthropocentric impressions from the world because we have human ears. And so we hear this as opposed to what a bat would hear. We're seeing this particular spectrum, whereas we don't see infrared and ultraviolet. Why? Not because the frequencies themselves are somehow intrinsically inaccessible. It's just our visual organism here, our faculties pick up that particular bandwidth. So Descartes raised this question, when nobody's looking, what's really out there? And he came up with what are the primary qualities, what he imagined to be the primary qualities, things like location, mass, size, volume, velocity. Doesn't matter whether, and if somebody throws a pebble at the back of your head, it strikes you whether you saw it or not. Right? So something happens when nobody's looking, and that's what physicists have been interested in ever since. What's going on when nobody's looking? Now, they weren't doing this out of sheer whimsy. They were doing this because they were seeking a God's eye perspective. When no human beings are looking on, who's really looking on? The big man in the sky. So what does the world look like from his perspective? So as quickly as possible, let's jettison this merely human perspective, the merely human subjective perspective, and try by means of technology and mathematics to think the language of God, which many physicists today think is exactly mathematics and no other, and to try to be able to view physical reality, the real world, physical reality, the real world, physical reality. We're seeing an equation here from God's own perspective. So let's put up some buffer zone between our purely human sense faculties and put up something out there that is objective, an objective data gatherer of the independent primary attributes of what's really out there. And the scientific attention got fixated on this, got riveted on this. And in the early days, this was a religious quest. It was not a secular, reductionistic, materialistic quest at all. It was basically in the same current as the mystics of the medieval period, the Meister Eckharts of the world, who are seeking to let their own awareness rise up to the level of God's own awareness. And now the scientists really trying to do the same thing, but looking not inwardly, which goes higher and higher, as Mark was saying, but looking outwardly. In this Cartesian dualism, the subjective phenomena of appearance have secondary attributes, and these are dependent upon consciousness, whereas the real physical world, that's primary, and that is independent of consciousness. That was the starting assumption. And that is the assumption of virtually all science that's gone on ever since. Now, when we address the issue of energy, especially in the context of physics, it's easy if one has not studied any history at all to kind of look at our current notions of energy in classical physics, classical mechanics, for example, to think that somehow they've always been there. But in the 17th century, there was quite a debate between Newton and his arch rival, Leibniz. And Newton spoke primarily of force. Force defined as in his three principal laws of mechanics. Force equals the product of mass times acceleration. So he didn't speak of energy so much as force, but in his view, bear in mind, he was a theologian. He spent most of the last 20, 30 years of his life doing more theology than he did in physics, which is something like, they try to cover that up ever since then. But he was a deeply religious man, something of a mystic, very interested in alchemy. And his notion was that there is this force out in the universe, and God is continuing to breathe into the universe. God is breathing force into it. So God didn't merely create the universe in that time, some thousands of years ago, but God is the owner and operator. He's still breathing into it. He's still maintaining it. He's giving it his energy. He's giving it force. And he sends his angels out to tinker with it when things go a little bit haywire. Like when the planet starts to stray. Then you got the angels kind of bump them back into shape. So this was, in this view, the universe was really a hands-on project for God. You know, it wasn't something he designed and walked away from. He designed it and he really ran it. You know, whereas in Leibniz's view, who was a co-discoverer of calculus, he spoke of the living force, and he had a very, very different definition of it: mass times velocity squared, which will look familiar to somebody who's taken junior high school physics. For some reason, I've forgotten, nowadays it's put in 1/2 mv squared as the way of calculating kinetic energy. But he spoke of this as a living force which God originally created when he created the universe, but which is conserved in all interactions forever thereafter. In other words, more of the notion that lent itself to deism, where God was crucial at the beginning, but basically made the universe so well that he could walk away from it and it would operate just fine by itself. All right? Well, Newton looked at Leibniz's equation, his mv squared here, and he said, this is bad. It's not just that I disagree, but this is bad. Because you've just stepped onto a slippery slope here. You've let God create the universe, but he created it so well that he doesn't do anything with it anymore. So now that you've made God irrelevant. I mean, it was really relevant a long time ago, but let bygones be bygones. And so there was a theological debate about the nature of energy that was steeped in their different views of the nature of God. So let's not kid ourselves to think that somehow physics arose out of some radical departure from theology. It was waist, if not neck up to its neck in theology. Well, both of these had their own merits, one for energy, one for force, so they didn't have to wind up defeating each other. And we see from the late 17th century into the mid-19th century just an extraordinary success story of classical mechanics. The physics of Newton, then elaborated by later generations, until we get to about the middle of the 19th century. A German physicist named Helmholtz, he took Leibniz's notion of the conservation of energy, which is very qualitative, it was more like a pure speculation, and he, for the first time, created a mathematical formulation of the principle of conservation of energy, in which mechanical phenomena, this was a great unifying feat, in which mechanical phenomena, heat, light, electricity, and magnetism are all viewed as manifestations of one stuff, energy. And in Helmholtz's view, this principle of the conservation of energy, this would lead to the complete comprehensibility of nature. Now bear in mind, what did he have in mind when he said nature? What was he thinking of? Nature as the objective physical universe, independent of consciousness, absolutely out there when nobody's looking. And the energy is going to be the conservation of energy is going to be the principle that makes it all hang together. But what happened in this process? Well, of course, our bodies are what's there when nobody's looking. Living bodies are there when nobody's looking in the physicist's view. And so now we have this conservation of energy, and it's all coming out of physics. It's not coming out of some other system. So the notion that there was some type of an energy that was unique to living organisms, plants and animals, for example, human beings, that you don't find anywhere else, with this mathematical formulation, that seemed to be suddenly, radically, and irretrievably undermined. Why? Because when physicists would look at your body, I as a physicist look at your body, and I bring out all of our modes of measurement, I find mechanical phenomena, I find things bumping into each other, I find heat, I find light, I find electricity, I find magnetism, but I don't find any kind of energy that is unique to you that's not to be found in the chair or other inanimate phenomena. It's more of the same. Light, electricity, heat, this is stuff that's already out there. And so suddenly now we have a paradigm for looking at living organisms as nothing other than an effulgence of inorganic matter. And they don't add anything new to it. It's just a greater complexity of configurations of what was already there, and what was already there were just particles of matter. So at this point, for the mainstream physicists, this was when they basically jettisoned any notion of vitalism, of there being subtle energies, vital energies that are unique to living organisms. And the physicists said, we have no evidence for it, using all of our technology, no evidence whatsoever. And moreover, and here is the real clincher, if there were some other type of energy, some vital energy, an élan vital, that didn't fit into mechanical phenomena, heat, light, and so forth, and it actually impinged upon your body, then that would imply a lack of conservation of energy, because something outside the physicist domain, from the domain of life, is coming and impinging, like an angel coming in and pushing planets around, right? And they say, from Helmut's time, and this has been corroborated in many ways, there is no such evidence for anything impinging upon your body as a machine. And therefore vitalism dies, it falls to the side of the tracks for lack of evidence, but also as a matter of principle. If it were there, it would violate the principle of conservation of energy, and the principle of conservation of energy is deeply cherished by physicists to this day. So just a couple of weeks ago, when I was at the Sorbonne for a conference in honor of Francisco Varela, who's a brilliant neuroscientist, did some very innovative work in the interface between contemplative practice, specifically Buddhism, and neuroscience. One of the many speakers, these are world-class scientists from literally all over the world. One of them, in an offhand comment, he said, and don't mistake this for the metaphysics of vitalism. And it was kind of like this dismissive gesture, you know. Like this is 150 years that we've known that stuff doesn't exist. So he said, don't mistake it for that. Okay, he was like putting it in the same category of phlogiston and caloric, and etc. Reference has been already made this morning to the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887, and the assumption prior to that point, the assumption in the mind of people like Lord Kelvin, working out of a total classical context of physics, of mechanics, was that everything could be understood in terms of machine. Things bumping into each other, all right? And that would explain everything. And that was a major, once again, a major foundation for throwing out vitalism, and then eventually throwing out consciousness, throwing out God, throwing out anything that's not material. But what was required is this luminiferous ether. And that is that there must be in space some type of a plenum, some type of stuff, mechanical stuff like water or air that ripples, right? When I'm speaking right now, you can hear me because there's a plenum in between called air, and it ripples and it hits your eardrum, and then that sets up events and gets to your auditory cortex, and now I'm going to go voila, and you hear. Exactly how that voila comes out, nobody really knows, but that the air is necessary is widely accepted. If we were speaking in deep space now, with basically a vacuum in between, you would hear about this. Because empty space doesn't act as a medium for sound waves. But light does. Light does go through empty space, so it was assumed that just like sound needs water or some solid substance or air, but some type of real substantial medium, likewise light must have, because why? It was well known that light propagates in waves, and those waves interaction, they set up interference patterns, and this was thoroughly and conclusively known, so there's got to be something out there that ripples, right? Except the little problem in 1887 that Michelson-Morley showed in a way that's never been repudiated, that this classical physical notion of a luminiferous ether that would actually ripple when light travels through it doesn't exist. Well, with that experiment, that undermined not what Mark was talking about, of a quantum plenum. That didn't undermine that at all. Quantum mechanics was 23 years ahead, or no, 13 years ahead. But it did radically and irretrievably undermine this classical dualistic notion of a mechanical view of electromagnetic energy. Because there are interference patterns, but there's nothing that ripples. There's no luminiferous ether. It's, as far as they knew then, empty. So that suddenly shifted the notion of energy. It's now energy, but without the mechanical substrate that actually ripples. Then we move ahead. What would this be, about 18 years or so? And Einstein's special relativity theory equals mc squared, and as Mark commented earlier, it suggests, as the understanding of energy matures, that energy is convertible into mass, mass into energy, or to phrase it another way, mass is nothing other than an expression of energy. And if energy is energy and mass is energy, that kind of like makes energy pretty central, pretty dominant, if not absolutely ubiquitous. But now keep on moving. 1905, let's now move into the realm of quantum electrodynamics, into the 1920s, 1930s, and then on into the present, because this is an ongoing developing field. And now how is light viewed in this context? Now this is totally mainstream physics, and to which I've contributed nothing. I'm simply reporting, but we'll see where we go from there. So to the best of my knowledge, everything I'm saying about physics is what you'll hear at Harvard and Princeton and Berlin and Sorbonne. There's nothing weird. This is not weird physics. This is just kind of ordinary, but very cool physics. Light, in this context, is an oscillation of abstract field quantities in space. How tangible does that sound? An oscillation, because it's not an oscillation of some rippling kind of goop, like an ether goop that goes like Jell-O. There ain't no Jell-O. That's what they found with Michaels and Morley. So this kind of classical Jell-O, that's not out there. And so what does vibrate or oscillate? Abstract field quantities. You're down to mathematics. And it's not an oscillation of space proper, for nothing actually oscillates. So it's an oscillation of abstraction. If that sounds a little bit wobbly to you, so to me also. Shaky, but the only problem, there's no ground. It's just shaky. So we have this vacuum. Now this is very cool here. It's a false vacuum. And in a vacuum, I will still use the word, although I think Mark's criticisms were exactly valid. But take a volume of space, and now suck everything out of it you possibly can. Try to get all the atoms out. You won't entirely succeed, but do your best. And try to cool it down to absolute 0 Kelvin. You won't succeed, but do your best. Try to get all the electromagnetic fields out of it. Well, pretty good. Try to get the gravitational energy out of it. No luck at all. Because if you could do that, then you could levitate in it, and we'd all want to live in there, you know. Even when you got heavy and fat, you know, you wouldn't feel it, because you could levitate. So a vacuum is a volume of space in which you've taken out everything you can, given the limitations of a technology. It was actually a disciple of Galileo, Evangelista Tortellini, I think, Evangelini Tortellini, who created the first vacuum. Nature hated him for that, you know, because nature is supposed to abhor a vacuum, and this guy came along and made one anyway. She got over it. But this is a false vacuum because it's not really total, you know. It's relative. It's just as relative as your technology is good. So he had a pretty crummy one, just like Galileo had a pretty crummy telescope if we compare it to the Hubble telescope. But he made a step in the right direction by insulting what Aristotle said was nature's own voice, that nature just doesn't allow that kind of thing. He says, oh yeah? And he created one. But this is a frozen vacuum in the sense, as Mark so rightly pointed out, it is not devoid of energy. Do with it whatever you like. But it's not devoid of energy. It is simply the lowest possible available vacuum under present circumstances, just contingent upon your technology. It does have energy, it does have internal structure, and is not, this relative or false or frozen vacuum is not perfectly symmetrical. Henning Gens wrote a beautiful book on the vacuum called, I think it was called either Nothing or Nothingness, about which he had a lot to say. Or some years ago at UC Santa Barbara, when I was still teaching there, I organized a whole conference on nothing. People had a lot to say about it from different perspectives. And the head of the Institute of Theoretical Physics started his by saying, my talk will be much ado about nothing. So we had a lot of fun with the terminology. But here's Henning Gens, a German physicist, who wrote this splendid, rather academic book. But he says real systems are, in this sense, excitation, real systems like a room, like an auditorium, like your body, like a galaxy. What are these? These are, in a sense, excitations of the vacuum. Much as surface waves in a pond are excitations of the pond's water. But bear in mind, this is not the old mechanical ether that Michaels and Morley actually did demonstrate doesn't exist. This is something far more subtle that comes out of quantum electrodynamics and not out of classical physics. The vacuum in itself is shapeless, but it may assume specific shapes, almost like a magician. In doing so, it becomes a physical reality, a real world. But this real world that we think is made up of chunky stuff, this is mainstream physics. It's nothing other than configurations of empty space. Space that got perturbed. Now, in contrast to this, let's just go back This was the false vacuum. What's the true vacuum? Well, the true vacuum is a volume of space in which everything is taken out of it, allowed by the laws of physics. In other words, not contingent upon your technology, but what in principle is the emptiest you could possibly create of a volume of space. And this is called the melted vacuum, and this has infinite energy. It's a zero-point energy. It is perfectly symmetrical. That is, it has no internal structure. It has no forward and back, up and down. It has no differentiation between particles and fields and so forth. It is smooth. It has no internal structure. And so within this melted vacuum, particles, waves, energy are undifferentiated. It is smooth, timeless, featureless, empty space, but filled with infinite energy. What significance might that have for cosmogony, the development of the cosmos we know of? A very fine science writer for the LA Times, Casey Cole, writes this. She says, like water freezing into ice and releasing its energy into its surroundings, the freezing of the vacuum liberates enormous amounts of energy. As simply as water freezing into ice, the inflated vacuum, this is the inflationary model of the universe after the Big Bang, where there's this rapid acceleration of energy coming out, but ever so quickly. Where is this all coming from? Well, quite possibly from this true vacuum. This true vacuum, since it has an infinite pool to draw from, it liberates enormous amounts of energy, and as simply as water freezing into ice, the inflated vacuum froze into the structure that gave rise to quarks, electrons, and eventually us. We are luminous empty space. We are configurations of empty space. Empty, which is infinitely full. Coming back to Henning Gens, he's speaking about the quantum mechanical, not classical mechanical, but the quantum mechanical fluctuations of this true vacuum. He says maybe quantum mechanical fluctuations initiated not only the stuff our world was made of prior to inflation, but also space-time itself. So maybe space is not only the womb of matter or mass energy, but actually of space and time. In other words, this is space beyond space, out of which relative space that warps and woofs and so forth according to general relativity. Maybe this is that out of which time itself, space-time, the space-time continuum itself emerges. Maybe this true vacuum, the true nothing of philosophy and religion should be seen as a state wholly innocent of laws, space and time, utterly transcendent. Again, what floors me here, this is mainstream physics. Come back to the theme of energy. That's now gone through these many generations since the debate between Newton and Leibniz. We draw on this brilliant, quixotic, charismatic, and sometimes downright weird physicist Richard Feynman. Brilliant, Nobel laureate. And he comments in his very, very famous lecture series, the Feynman Lecture Series, it is important to realize in physics today we have no knowledge of what energy is. Actually, I got into that myself when I was studying physics, still as a Buddhist monk. Having immersed myself in Tibetan civilization and meditation and Buddhist philosophy and so forth for 14 years, I wanted to reintegrate myself, and I thought, well, let's reintegrate with one element of my own background was science. So I thought, let's go for the paradigm of science. The science that all the other sciences are trying to emulate, whether they acknowledge it or not. But you're good science insofar as you like physics. And so I took a whole course. I took many, many courses on physics at Amherst, but one was solely devoted to energy. 15 weeks just devoted to studying energy. And we had a senior professor. She was here as a visitor from the University of Michigan, distinguished, elderly, lots of experience behind her. And we got a little ways into the course, and I raised my hand in the class and said, Professor, what is energy? I mean, I know how to do the calculations, and there are various ways of measuring it, but what is it that we're calculating, that we're measuring either theoretically or with measurement systems? What is it? And she looked at me with this quizzical kind of nonplussed expression. She said, well, nobody's ever asked me that before. I don't know. I'll get back to you. I'll speak with my colleagues. And she's a good scientist. She didn't try to, pull the wool over my eyes. And so the next time she came back and she said, well, we don't really know. But now let's get on with the class. don't let the fact that we don't know what energy is hold you back at all from studying all these ways of measuring it and seeing how it's conserved and how it goes into one thing, and it's actually everything is energy except for everything is something that we don't know at all what it is. Doesn't give you kind of a nice warm cozy feeling that now I got it. We don't know anything. And as for this marvelous stroke that was going to lead to the complete comprehensibility of nature, Helmholtz, 1847, this conservation of energy is a mathematical principle, but not a description of a mechanism or anything concrete. That's Feynman. You don't get much more mainstream than him. So now what is the real nature of mass energy when we consider, again, mass, the mass of our kneecaps, the mass of our bodies, the mass of this room, is actually nothing other than energy, right? I mean, that's well established. We can ask these questions, does matter even exist independently of measurement? There are still some physicists who believe yes, but it's a hard sell. Because in quantum mechanics, before measurement, you got a probability wave. How would you like to go and give a big hug to a probability wave? It's just not very tangible. It's about as tangible as those mathematical quantities that go into the empty space. It's pretty conceptual. We can ask of fields themselves. In physics, we so often speak of particles and fields. Do fields themselves, electromagnetic fields, for example, exist as anything but mathematical formalisms? In other words, do they just exist as something we concocted? No clear answer. Mass energy, is that anything more than a fluctuation of empty space? If you're a betting man, I would say bet on not. It's probably just a fluctuation of empty space. Well, all of this glorious illumination that's taking place, this much ado about nothing, has deep roots. We can go back to a contemporary, actually, of Buddha, 6th century BCE, Pythagoras, one of my heroes. And among his, he's a fascinating character. We could spend the whole time just on Pythagoras. But one of the aphorisms that he's very well known for is that everything is numbers. Everything boils down to numbers. Okay? And then later, those following in his footsteps, the Pythagoreans, they elaborated a little bit and said, well, these numbers, everything boils down to numbers, but these are identified with geometrical forms. Everything really boils down to quantitative geometrical forms. And then another generation, we have Plato. He expands this out beyond the purely quantitative into the qualitative. He said, this world of experiences, the shadows at the back of the cave, this is derivative of an underlying realm, a deeper realm of pure ideas. That's where reality really is. And what we're experiencing in day-to-day life are the epiphenomena of some more rarefied realm of pure ideas. You see the same continuum here. But was that the only voice in Greek antiquity? No, there was another very loud voice whose words have been reverberating for the last 2,300 years or so, and that was Democritus. And here's this famous aphorism from him: in reality, there's only atoms moving in space. So Descartes and Newton and Galileo and basically all of classical mechanics has been getting a high off of that one ever since. Because they've been following that one and not the Pythagoreans or Platonic notion. But now let's bring a quantum response to that. Now move the movie forward quite rapidly, back up to the 20th century again. Werner Heisenberg, one of the great architects of quantum mechanics, makes this comment. With regard to this question, what's the nature of matter, energy, the physical universe, modern physics takes a definite stand against the materialism of Democritus and for Plato and the Pythagoreans. If materialism, or specifically scientific materialism, were a company, a public company on the stock market, Dow Jones, sell short. Because they're saying everything boils down to matter, except for matter boils down to ideas or empty space. So often I do a lot of work with neuroscientists, and most of them say, of course, all mental phenomena are simply epiphenomena or qualities or functions of matter. And yet I think their notion of matter is stuck somewhere about 1850 or 1830. Like nothing's, have you noticed that it's vanished? Back in the 60s, some of you might recall the movement from some very, very liberal-minded, maybe even the nihilistic theologians. God is dead. Remember, God is dead? God was very troubled by that report. Reports of my death have been grossly exaggerated. Who is it that said that? Churchill or somebody like that. Mark Twain, exactly. So maybe Mark Twain got it from God or vice versa. But, I mean, the whole notion, the very notion of God has been completely antiquated, had absolutely no support, so ergo God is dead. Materialism is dead. They just haven't, kind of, the whiplash hasn't caught them yet. Physics, this last 400 years of physics has conceived of an objective world devoid of consciousness and subjective experience. That was the whole point. That was the Cartesian goal. What lies out there independent of consciousness, independent of subjective appearance? What's out there when God is looking and nobody else? And of course, if God was looking, then that world was filled with God's consciousness. But now, instead of looking for the God's eye view, in the words of one philosopher of mind, philosopher of science, Thomas Nagel, this is shifted over to a view from nowhere. No one looking from nowhere at whatever's taking place, but they're looking with no consciousness. So what does that give you? It gives you a hypothetical world. The world of physics is a world devoid of consciousness and subjective experience. There's no physicist's definition of consciousness. There's no physicist's way of measuring consciousness. It may as well be Casper the Friendly Ghost. I mean, we can talk about it, but there's absolutely no way of measuring consciousness using the tools of physics. And there's no physicist's definition of consciousness either. It does not exist in their world. But, to share a nasty little secret, the only world that we know is real is one with consciousness. Ergo, the world that the physicists are conceiving of is make-believe. We don't even know whether their world exists at all. This world devoid of consciousness, devoid of subjective experience. Who's ever seen it? And why should we believe in it? And if you saw it, look out. Because it may have been that your consciousness crept into it. The real world that we know exists is experienced within intersubjective fields of consciousness. It's multiple scientists running a similar experiment and then corroborating it by third-person experience. But it's just a whole bunch of first-person experiencers getting together and agreeing. But the third person is not really somebody else, apart from a first person. So what has happened here in the history of science is something really quite odd. We've just gotten really used to it. It's kind of like smog in LA. You know, it's really odd not to see the mountains. And when I was growing in the LA basin, it was really odd to be playing tennis on the varsity team and not be able to breathe deeply. You learn how to be very clever. You breathe really shallowly as you're playing your tennis game. This is quite a feat. It's not easy to play a really rigorous game, three sets of tennis and breathe shallowly. But we all got used to it. That's just the nature of air in LA, right? We've gotten used to the notion that from the time of Copernicus, it was a 300-year lag time before scientists got around to thinking it might be worthwhile to study the mind. How odd is that? When their primary instrument for studying the physical universe was the mind. Imagine I give you a gizmo. I'm going to give you a really complex gizmo here. Here's a gizmo. And I would say, use this, look through this, and you will discover the wonders of nature. Just look through it. And how gullible will you be if you say, okie dokie, and you never bother to look at the gizmo? Did I just give you a kaleidoscope? How do you know that the gizmo is actually going to give you some accurate information unless you actually examine the gizmo itself? But we took 300 years before we got around to that. It's kind of like, how important could that be after all? And so the mind was excluded from the scientific worldview for 300 years, and to a large extent, now a decreasing extent, it's still excluded, I think to a troubling extent, from mainstream biomedicine at Johns Hopkins, UCSF, Harvard Medical School, and they're doing their best to keep it out. That's why millions and millions and millions of dollars are spent every year trying to get that doggone placebo effect out of there. What is the placebo effect? You know, it's a euphemism. It's a mind effect. But they don't want to call it a mind effect because the mind isn't supposed to have any effects. The things that are supposed to have effects are electrons and particles and molecules and genes, but not some kind of Casper the Ghost getting in there and just believing that something will make you well that actually makes you better. How weird is that? You know, so it's kind of like the black sheep in the family. Let's spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year to keep that placebo effect out of there. Kind of like the nephew that you just, like the bastard cousin. He's not really of our family, and don't mind him, he won't do anything. In this triple blind experiment, he won't do anything at all. So the placebo effect is just one way that this mind has been excluded from scientific method, and the sad truth is that here in the 21st century, we don't have a science of consciousness, at least in mainstream academia. But now let's shift. I said I'd speak about scientific and contemplative. I find the science itself pretty fascinating. I mean, really weird, but very fascinating and also very productive. I mean, it's quite beautiful. But while the science has picked up on this kind of weird notion of Descartes, let's look at the universe independent of experience, as if that were possible. As if the ideas you have of fields and particles and waves are occurring any place other than in the field of your own consciousness. As if. In the meantime, pretty much everybody else, the Greeks with pneuma, Indians with prana, Tibetans with lung, Chinese with chi, Japanese ki, Native American mana, all of these are viewing energy as something that's part of our experienced world. This is the crucial issue that took me actually some years to figure out as I was immersing myself in Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan culture and language. How come they're talking funny? How come they're not approaching it, correctly? And correct, of course, is the Cartesian way. Why aren't they talking about what's really out there when nobody's looking? And they said, who cares about what's out there when nobody's looking, because everything that matters to us is happening when it's actually engaging with us. It's the Lebenswelt, it's this world of experience. And so in this world of experience, where your shirt is red, I'm not hypothesizing some invisible molecules that have no color. I'm saying, your shirt's red. And I'm just going to stop right there. I'm not going to worry about what your shirt looked like when nobody's looking. You really want to go to a market and say, I'd like one of those shirts that looks really good when nobody's looking, please. Then God will be especially pleased, because that's the only. So such energy, this experienced energy that is a feature of your own experience, this is thought to underlie, in these multiple traditions, is thought to underlie, empower, and regulate all physical and mental phenomena. In other words, it has an extremely central role. Very much like the conservation of energy in this abstracted objective world had a role in the world or the imagination of Helmholtz. We see this in tremendous role of this vital energy in traditional medical traditions. Tibetan medicine is certainly no exception. A lot can be said about that. I'll be very, very brief now as time passes so quickly. But there are ways then not only of identifying and experiencing this vital energy, but then regulating it, refining it, modulating it through physical exercise, through asanas, through Tai Chi, Qigong, etc. Royal Canadian Air Force exercises. It all has an impact on the Qi. Diet certainly influences your Qi or your prana. Medical treatment, a lot of medical treatment, of course acupuncture, but the herbal compounds Tibetans give have a great, impact on these energies. Visualization itself, visualizing especially things, images, colors, and so forth in your body directly influences these prana. So there are very many ingenious ways of modulating, balancing, directing the pranas, these subtle energies within the body. But there's something here, even though time is so short, this I think is really quite extraordinary, and that is the natural healing power of the breathing when it is mindful. And we could spend the whole rest of the time easily on this, which is not a whole lot of time. But this practice, this classic Buddhist practice of mindfulness of breathing, in this practice, you don't try to regulate your breath at all. You are vividly aware of it, attentively aware of it from moment to moment to moment. As the breath flows in like the tide, the breath flows out like the tide. But with no ego-driven desires, ambition, manipulation, regulation, you're just observing the body balancing itself out. As you mindfully, continuously, in a relaxed but vigilant way, attend to the breath. And the Buddha said, as a result of such practice, just as in the last month of the hot season, when a mass of dust and dirt has swirled up a great rain cloud out of season, disperses it and quells it on the spot, so too concentration by mindfulness of breathing, when developed and cultivated, is peaceful and sublime, an ambrosial dwelling, and it disperses and quells on the spot detrimental, unwholesome states whenever they arise. He's not pointing out how clever we can be by applying ourselves skillfully to some ingenious technique, but rather by being very passive but luminously clear. Just stand back and watch this body balance itself, the mind balance itself to what he calls an ambrosial dwelling. I think there's no time for that. Very interesting. As a result of such practice, as the mind settles, Mark was talking about the mind coming in. Well, imagine as a pretty close metaphor, imagine falling asleep luminously. Imagine falling asleep lucidly, without kind of dozing out, getting dull, just blacking out. But imagine maintaining a total luminosity, a clarity, vigilance of awareness, and falling fast asleep, and watching your senses withdraw from the sensory fields, which is exactly what happens when you fall asleep. And imagine then you're going into deep sleep and watching your conceptual faculties go quiescent. And the faculties of imagination and desire and memory, quiescent, into an inner stillness and emptiness that is luminous. This is called in Buddhism the substrate consciousness, the alaya vijnana. It happens every night, but most of us miss out on it because we're not clear. We dope out as we're falling asleep, and so we miss the fun. We just get a good night's sleep out of it, but we're not able to explore this substrate consciousness. This is a vacuous. Now notice the interesting parallel in terminology. It is vacuous, but this is a state of consciousness, a vacuous, luminous state in which all sensory experience, thoughts, and mental images have disappeared. They've withdrawn. It's like all the kinetic energy of the mind is withdrawn back into potential energy. Almost all, not quite all. This is the ground state of the psyche from which all mental activities emerge. This is a fundamental point of separation between the mainstream cognitive neurosciences and contemplative traditions around the world, and now here most explicitly in Buddhism. Most neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists will tell you that all mental phenomena are arising as emerging from the brain, emerging from matter, which has been around for the last 13.8 billion years or so. And Buddhism says there's no evidence for that. Buddhist contemplatives, that's just a great big supposition. You don't know that. What makes you think such an odd notion? That the fact that the brain conditions the mind, of course, but conditioning, influencing on the one hand, and actually giving birth to? And these are two very different kettles of fish. And we have empirical evidence that suggests that what we regard as our psyche, our mental activity, is not emerging from the brain. It's conditioned by the brain. It can be impaired by brain damage. It's emerging from this substrate, this relative vacuum state of consciousness. When you abide in this, and there's a way to meditatively access this and be able to linger in it with great clarity and stability for hours on end, when you abide in that substrate consciousness, bear in mind, this is not God consciousness or ultimate pure consciousness or nirvana or Buddha nature. This is just the relative ground of your substrate. When the kinetic energy of your mind has gone dormant, this consciousness is stripped of its uniquely human characteristics. It's not human anymore. There's nothing about it that's human or ethnic, African American, Anglo, whatever. Gender, it's beyond gender, it's beyond language, it's prior to language, and other modes of biological and cultural conditioning, whatever your genetic heritage is, your cultural conditioning, this is prior to all of that. But it's not ultimate. This is like a relative vacuum state. And what it's like to experience this, I draw from a great 19th century Dzogchen master, Dzogchen, the great perfection, in my mind and the mind of many other people, the most sublime manifestation of Tibetan Buddhism. Drawing from his own experience, he says, when you dwell in this substrate consciousness, which again is a relative state, so easy to be confused with some ultimate state, a primordial consciousness. This is just relative. But even here, awareness is stabilized in an unfluctuating state with the experience of joy like the warmth of a fire, luminosity like the dawn, and non-conceptuality like an ocean unmoved by waves. What are you aware of when you're abiding, when you settle back into the substrate consciousness? You're aware of this space of awareness, the substrate itself, the alaya. This is immaterial. It has no atomic construction to it. It has a space-like vacuity, devoid of thought, in which appearances are impeded. It's an emptiness, but it's a luminous emptiness. This we can say is a false mental vacuum, having some very interesting parallels with the false vacuum of physics, and it does also bear its own internal structure. It has a kind of a subliminal dualistic quality to it of subject and object. It's conditioned by actions, it's conditioned by karma, but it's subliminal. It's kind of like not so obvious, just like the relative vacuum. But this is the basis of emergence of all mental activity and appearances, and it's aroused out of this vacuous state, from this potential state into a kinetic state, by conceptual negation and affirmation. Is not, I like, I don't like. And is there an energy in that substrate, in this vacuum state of the mind? Yet the dissolution of the coarse energies occurs during the dying process. The energies that are these living energies, these vital energies, pranas, these withdraw, and these are very carefully studied in the Tibetan tradition. These are withdrawing into the heart of these coarse energies, going into a more subtle domain of energy. happens in the dying process, but not quite at the end of it, prior to the end of it. And there is a conservation of individual substrate consciousness. That is, this consciousness, as Mark was commenting, it's not derivative of something else. It's as fundamental as you get. And there is a consummation principle of that. And this level of consciousness, the substrate consciousness, is correlated to a subtle realm of energy that carries on after death, a mental body, very much like a dream body, that carries on after death. And this is something, although there's no time to elaborate now, something that can be studied empirically. This is not a matter of religious belief. When I speak about this to scientists, the first thing that pops into mind is metaphysics. Metaphysics is always relative. What are the boundaries of your present modes of experience? Whatever lies beyond your boundaries in 2004, that's metaphysics. But in the 19th century, the existence of atoms was metaphysics. In 1994, the existence of planets around other stars was metaphysics. In the first decade, 2 decades of the 20th century, the existence of other galaxies was metaphysics. But there were technological advances, and that which was metaphysics was drawn over into empiricism. This substrate is a repository of memories, behavioral tendencies. This gives rise to the coherence from lifetime to lifetime. This also, I think, we don't have time for. It's pretty cool, but we don't have time. I mean, I'm seeing 5 minutes. I'm trying to be a law-abiding citizen here. Actually, if we're going to get here, we need that. So, yeah, this will actually be necessary. When you achieve the state of meditative quiescence, settling in the substrate luminously for a sustained period, you have access to another dimension of existence. It's often translated from the Sanskrit as desire realm. You could also call it the desire dimension. This is the dimension, the kind of the context of our daily lives, and it's called desire because we are driven by our desires. We hear, smell, think, taste things that we're drawn to, and off we go. So we are driven by desires. But beyond this kind of coarse realm of experience dominated by the physical senses, and I found the comments about autism so interesting in this regard. There's a lot of relevance here, I think. But beyond that is a more rarefied, subtle realm of existence, a realm of pure forms, a realm of archetypal representations. This is in Buddhism. A phenomena experienced in the desire realm. In other words, what's in the desire realm is bulky and coarse and crude and seems to be chunky, but it's simply like a display, an outer manifestation of these archetypal representations in the form realm. And among these displays are the elements of earth. Anything that is solid is a representation of earth. And water, fluidity, fire, heat, air, motility, light, and space, all that we're experiencing in our day-to-day experience, all of these are epiphenomena. Not of neurons. The neurons are epiphenomena. Epiphenomena of a deeper realm of consciousness called the form realm. This form realm, again, sounds like metaphysics, and it is if you don't have experience. But if you achieve meditative quiescence, refine the tension to that degree, bring about that deep degree of stability and clarity, then you can access this perceptually, that is experientially. It's no longer a matter of metaphysics, it's something you know, just like the taste of chocolate. The taste of chocolate is metaphysics for people who have never eaten chocolate. It's just that mundane. And anybody who's had a Hershey bar in their mouth, it's no longer metaphysics. This is cheap chocolate. But is it possible that while the contemplatives, and bear in mind there's nothing sectarian about this. This is not a Buddhist shtick. This is anybody who develops this mode of samadhi, and it's not hinged upon some ideological belief system. This is technology. This is a technology of the mind called samadhi. Anybody who achieves it, this should be accessible perceptually. But for those mathematicians, might they be accessing that same dimension, but doing it by the brilliance of their intelligence, by means of mathematics, going back to Pythagoras and following the trajectory since then? Might mathematicians, especially the great ones, be accessing that same form, but doing so conceptually as they were aspiring to do, think the thoughts of God? But beyond this form realm, beyond the relative vacuum of consciousness, is primordial consciousness, primordial awareness. This is the ultimate ground. This is non-local. It's not located here as opposed to there. It's beyond time. It is naturally luminous. You don't add its luminosity or clarity to it. It is all-pervasive ground of the emergence of all phenomena. Not just your own mental states, the whole shebang, everything. This is all galactic clusters and black holes and dark matter. Everything. Big bangs are arising out of this, including the individual streams of substrate consciousness, which are individual from one individual to the next. This primordial consciousness is said experientially to be non-dual from the most subtle energy, the subtlest prana, very subtle prana, which is called, and that is said to be infinite. But this is experience. And this primordial consciousness is non-dual from the absolute space of phenomena, the Dhammadhatu. What is that? This is non-dual space. It's not space out there where nobody's looking. This is the absolute space out of which relative space is emerging. This non-dual space, the space out of which the whole Lebenswelt, the whole world of experience is arising, this is imbued with infinite energy. It is this non-dual space, not the objective space of physicists, which is kind of like a pared down or abstracted space out there in the so-called objective universe. This is the space out of which relative space and time, mass and energy, mind and matter, subject and object, and even the fundamental categories of existence and non-existence emerge. This absolute space defies and transcends all of our conceptual categories. And all of these dualities arise out of that. Whereas Descartes was very happy to absolutely reify them and stop right there. This absolute space of phenomena is ineffable, cannot be articulated as inconceivable, but it is accessible. It's not just metaphysics, it's accessible through contemplative training, including the mastery of subtle energies, about which a lot could be said, but not now. Dude, maybe so. I haven't quite squeezed this lemon dry.
You have a half an hour of questions and answers.
Okie dokie. So if I encroach a little bit, it might be okay. A wee bitty, as the Scots say. Dujun Limba, coming back to this formidable 19th century contemplative, he says, when he speaks of this non-duality of primordial consciousness and the absolute space of phenomena, this ultimate ground out of which all dualities and manifest diversity arises, this ground is like water in its natural fluid state, freezing in a cold wind. Do you see a certain, are you having a déjà vu experience here? From Henning Gens, Casey Cole? It is due to dualistic grasping, perturbations, fluctuations, onto objects, subjects and objects, that the ground, which is naturally free, open, spacious, becomes frozen into the appearances of things. In other words, exactly the same metaphor. But this is coming out of the Lebenswelt, out of the actual world of experience, and not out of some abstracted true vacuum that is only imagined by physicists in some purely objective world devoid of consciousness. So in this regard, we can look at three dimensions of energy. Coarse energy correlated with the body-mind, the human psyche, EEG, and all the kind of, just this body and the kind of energies flowing through it. Coarse, not that they're crude, but just coarse with respect to other dimensions of energy. And then there's this more subtle energy, this energy correlated with the substrate consciousness, which carries on from lifetime to lifetime. It's energy. It's experienced firsthand as energy. It's not just consciousness. It's energy consciousness. And it said actually that the subtle energy is the stuff out of which your bardo forms, your forms following death, the form that you take on is a formation of, an expression of that very subtle energy. And then finally this most subtle energy, correlated with primordial consciousness, indivisible from primordial consciousness, and the absolute space of phenomena. So three dimensions of energy. So we see a remarkable resemblance and yet disparity as well. We find the false and true vacuum states of modern physics, the false and true vacuum states of consciousness. Remarkable parallels. And they go on, much more detail than I can give tonight, or this afternoon, or whatever it is. Still morning? Still morning. I was in Paris 10 days ago, so give me a little bit of slack here. It's morning someplace and it's night someplace. And then there's this creative energy of this non-dual space, the energy out of which all other forms of energy, electromagnetic and so forth, emerge as derivative. So what is our challenge facing us in this extraordinary phase of history we're passing through, which I think is, as far as we know from recorded history, is unprecedented? Reintegrating a fragmented world. This objective world of science I would view as a conceptual abstraction. Very useful, very powerful. It's given us an enormous amount of knowledge, for which I think respect and appreciation, especially in medicine and transportation and communication, is due. But this objective world, the actual view of the world coming from this Cartesian split of the absolute objective world, this is a conceptual abstraction from the non-dual world of our everyday experience. and the more rarefied non-dual world of contemplative insight, going to the levels of the substrate consciousness onto primordial consciousness. It's not only in their fundamental views of reality, but it's also what are they good for? What are the contemplative views and practices good for? What are the scientific views and practices good for? And the one word that just leaps to mind is that they are complementary. Would I want to just turn the wheels back 400 years and go back to Copernicus and not have this trajectory of modern science? I couldn't have gotten here. I was in New York yesterday. That's a long walk, let alone the swim from Paris over to the English Channel and so forth. And the communication, my wife is Mongolia, we're in daily email contact. I really like that. So how can we take the goodness, the majesty, the beauty, and the depth of our modern scientific understanding, and how can this be integrated with the beauty, the depth, the majesty, and the pragmatic value of the contemplative views of space, time, matter, energy, and fundamentally healing, but healing in the broadest sense of the term. Not just healing yourself from cirrhosis or asthma or the many, many things that medical traditions treat. The healing of ourselves as individuals, holistically. The healing of ourselves as families, as communities. The healing of a nation. Our nation is ailing. I think can that even be possibly contested no matter what one's political views are? A profoundly ailing nation. And profoundly ailing in our relationship to our allies and to our foes. The world is ailing. Internationally we are ailing. The planet is ailing. And given the seriousness of the affliction, how can we offer anything less than the full richness of human wisdom? Responding with compassion and wisdom, drawing from all of our traditions, gathering in one mighty effort to respond to a peril that endangers us all. And yet there's comfort that our compassion is not something we're conjuring up out of our genetic heritage or some peculiar chemicals in our brains. It's not something we generate with effort. The compassion, the love that we share is coming from the deepest dimension of our existence. And the deepest dimension of our existence is the deepest dimension of existence. So we can end on a light note. God is on our side.